please resume? Will you please? Will you please resume your seat? Will you please resume your seat? No, no. Please don't make a charade of the dail. Please resume your seat. No, no. Please resume your seat. Please resume your seat. Will you resume your seat? Will you? Don't make me adjourn the House, Deputy. Please. Deputy, resume your seat. Resume, Deputy. You're called on. You're being called on by the chair. You're being grossly disorderly. Please resume your seat. Please resume your seat. You will continue to be disorderly. The House is suspended. The House is suspended. Please, in a more orderly fashion. Deputy Matty McGrath, please. No, you've had your turn. You've had your turn. Resume your seat.
There was an agreement made.
There was no agreement made. Sorry. Resume your seat. Resume your seat, please. Please resume your seat. No, there's a lot. When the chair is on its feet, the member resumes their seat. There was no agreement made. Excuse me, Deputy. There was a. Will you resume your seat? Will you please resume your seat? Please do not make a laughing stock of this Dáil. Please, Deputy, the public are looking in. They're seeing your behaviour. Will you please behave in a responsible manner? Will you resume your seat? Please do not force me to again suspend the House. Resume your seat, Deputy. Deputy, please. I don't know if you've had, maybe you have had too much sun in the course of the week. Would you please resume your seat? Thank you. Deputy Matty McGrath, please.
In the programme for government, there is a commitment to increasing accessibility to the court's legal systems. However, 40 years on from the introduction of the free legal aid, there is still no such option available for Irish families facing eviction from the family homes and family farms. Indeed, that Josie Airy case led by Mary Robinson at the time. This has led to persons regularly being sent to jail when they won't vacate their homes. And we have a housing crisis, as you know. So, Taoiseach, when are you going to have free legal aid for these people who are being intimidated by the justice system, who go all the way up then and they get legal aid at the Supreme Court after they have had no representation all that time because you're afraid of the European courts? So will you please implement a free legal aid for these people who are trying to keep roofs over their heads? You have criminals with 40 previous convictions and they're getting free legal aid, 100 previous convictions, and a family trying to keep a roof over their family's head can't get free legal aid.
As I understand it, free legal aid is available from the government-funded free legal advice centres for people seeking it. But I'll get a more detailed answer for the deputy and supply it to him. Just on a previous question, I just have confirmation now that no migrants rescued from the Mediterranean by our Navy have been handed over to the Libyan Coast Guard.
Large numbers of people continue to be denied access to timely health care, whether that's at hospital or community level, and the recruitment and retention problems within the health service are now reaching crisis point. Now, Sláintecare is an all-party strategy to address those kind of deep and structural problems and to bring about reform of the health service, to bring it into line with the best practice in Europe. But we don't know where the government now stands in relation to Sláintecare. You promised a government response by last Christmas. You promised the establishment of an implementation office. You promised that a lead executive would be recruited months ago, and none of these things has happened. You promised legislation in this area as well, and we still haven't seen that. So what now is the government's position in respect of Sláintecare?
The office has been established, and we are in a position to appoint a lead executive for Sláintecare, so we should be able to do that very shortly. The Minister in the next couple of weeks will bring the implementation plan to Cabinet. While I think the Sláintecare report is very good and contains some principles, in fact all of which I agree with, does fall down in a lot of areas, and actually when you read the sections on recruitment and retention and you read the sections on using public money efficiently and making sure that the money actually gets to the patient, there isn't an awful lot on that actually, which is why we needed to do so much work to bring it to implementation plan standard.
The response you gave to me last week in Leaders' Questions, I was asking about the issue of directly elected mayors, and I was very glad that you seemed to indicate that in the issue of, with regard to Cork, Limerick, Waterford and Galway, you would intend to proceed with the ability for people to vote, to have a plebiscite on it, and Dublin you'd have to look at the issue. It was complex. Have you decided that issue with regard to allowing the people of Dublin to have a direct elected mayor? And there was one slight caveat when I read the transcript back afterwards. You seemed to indicate that you would have the plebiscite in May. I presume that was a kind of that you intend to have the plebiscite this October, and then we would actually vote for mayoral candidates in May. You're not considering having a plebiscite in May at the same time we have the local elections, which would be slightly farcical, that we would be asking people whether they want a different system and at the same time getting them to vote for the old system, as it were. Can you confirm just what exactly would the arrangements you intend to do on that issue?
There's no government decision on this yet, other than that we will have plebiscites on directly elected mayors. I think we need to be realistic about timelines. I don't think that it would be possible between October and May to pass all the legislation necessary to give effect to those new offices. So any of these things would need 1 or 2 years lead-in, and people will know from when the office of London Mayor was established. It took a number of years to establish it properly.
Deputy Chairman McConnell.
In relation to the situation with the very warm and good weather, which we all welcome, which also, as we know, brings us challenges, and particularly as well for the farming community. I would like to ask you to take up a matter with the Minister for Agriculture with regard to showing flexibility for farmers who are participating in the GLASS environmental scheme and who have taken up the traditional hay meadow option within that scheme, which prevents the cutting of grass and the cutting of hay before the 1st of July. That's 5 days from now, Taoiseach. I contacted the Minister over the weekend to ask that some flexibility would be shown. He has so far refused to do so. It's important, given the fact that we need to replenish fodder stocks, that every opportunity is given to the farming community to actually ensure they maximise their fodder saving this year. So I would ask you, Taoiseach, if you could respond to me in this matter and ensure that you take it up with the Minister for Agriculture and seek that some flexibility is given so that farmers can get on with that important work.
Thank you, Deputy. There are a number of your colleagues briefly on the same matter. Deputy Brazel.
Taoiseach, I very strongly ask that you would look at this issue, which is of great concern to the farming community. But in the cold spell that we had last January, or last March rather, you called on an emergency response unit to deal with the crisis that would occur from the very cold weather. And where everybody is welcoming fine weather, it does bring a considerable amount of challenges, particularly for elderly people, particularly for the farming community. You've got concerns around forest fires, and you've concerns around water shortages, particularly in our cities. So I would ask Taoiseach that you would consider reconvening that particular response unit, because although fine weather is something we all enjoy and welcome, the challenges that it brings are no less serious than they were during the cold weather, and I would ask you to seriously consider that, because it may be very necessary if it continues for the period that it is.
We won't get everyone in unless they're brief. Deputy Carol Nolan.
I'd just like to call on you, Taoiseach, to intervene. During our cold snap, the farming community were absolutely instrumental in our communities in helping out. This is a very reasonable request to bring that deadline forward, or that cutting date forward, to accommodate our farming families. And I also call on you. I have written to the Minister in relation to this issue also.
Deputy Moynihan. Deputy Murphy. Eugene Murphy.
Well, just very briefly, like my colleagues, like Deputy McConnell and others, I want to support this cause. I had actually 20 constituents who were involved in the GLASS scheme. And we need flexibility in this. Last year, because of the bad weather, those farmers couldn't actually cut those meadows. Now they need a little bit of flexibility to be able to cut them when the weather is good, and we don't know when that weather is going to break. So I've been in contact with the Minister, who had no response. So I'd ask you, Taoiseach, to get involved and maybe ask him if he can bring in a bit of flexibility to it.
Deputy Tony McLaughlin.
Support Deputy McConlough's request and plea. Perhaps maybe it's only a matter of a couple of days until the 1st of July. I know farmers are entered into a contract in GLASS, but I think that particularly in the constituency that I represent in Sligo Leitrim, South Donegal, and indeed in North Donegal as well, I know my colleague Deputy McHugh was speaking to me earlier today about this as well, that Taoiseach, there is a real urgency about this. I think it's vitally important that if we did give farmers an opportunity to cut hay this week, because we don't know what the weather is going to be like, and certainly in some of the areas that I represent, the land and everything else, that it's vitally important that we would get a positive response. Thank you.
Deputy Murphy O'Mahony.
It's a pity Minister Flanagan is gone, Taoiseach, because this question was for him really, but maybe you'll be able to answer me.
No, we'll have to come back to you if it's a separate matter.
Oh, sorry, no.
We're still on cutting the hay. Deputy Martin Kenny.
Make hay while the sun shines, and really that's what the farmers are trying to do out there. This is a very simple issue, and I know, in fairness, the Department has shown flexibility in the past when there was crisis, particularly around the slurry issues, and I think, and this is a very sensible thing, is simply to allow a little bit of flexibility that farmers can cut the hay meadows that couple of days earlier, because if they have to wait until the 1st of July, they may not be able to save the hay because it may be raining, and it's just as simple as that. So I think a little bit of flexibility by the Minister in this would solve an awful lot of problems.
And finally, Deputy Michael Healy-Rae on the same matter.
Yesterday I made contact with the Minister, obviously like a lot of my other colleagues, but unfortunately our call seems to be falling on deaf ears, because you all are aware that he made an announcement yesterday on Agri Time that he wasn't going to allow farmers this what I would call vital exemption, because it is only between here and the 1st, which is next Sunday. So I think that it is such an important thing that I think you should go to him today, Taoiseach, and say, in the interest of common sense and in the honour of God, we have this great opportunity. People should be encouraged at this stage to cutting rushes. People should be forbidding, not mind cutting hay, but waiting until next Sunday, and then maybe the weather to break next week, and it could cost thousands and thousands of euros to individual farmers. This is an opportunity that should be seized upon, and Taoiseach, it would be a mighty thing for you to be seen to be directly getting involved in this for yourself, and the people would be delighted with you.
Taoiseach. Have you ever cut hay, Taoiseach?
No, I picked stones many a summer. I've never cut hay. On the first matter of the National Emergency Coordination Group, at this time we don't believe it's necessary to convene it, as we're at status yellow in terms of the weather at the moment, although perhaps given the nature of the weather we're having, it should be status bronze rather than yellow. But we'll keep that under review. On glass, I'm advised by the Minister of Agriculture that there's no law or regulation prohibiting farmers from cutting hay before the 1st of July. However, under glass, some farmers have opted into the traditional hay meadow action. This is a voluntary action as part of a voluntary scheme, and if farmers choose to opt into this scheme, they are compensated at a rate of €315 per hectare, up to a maximum of 10 hectares. This is a biodiversity measure and will deliver approximately €18 million in payments this year, but it is optional, and the purpose of it is to maintain and conserve grassland flora and fauna.
All right, that concludes questions on promised legislation. My apologies to the deputies that we didn't reach. We must now proceed to Taoiseach's questions. I believe, Taoiseach, you propose to take question 1 to 5 together.
I was honoured to be the first EU leader to meet with Pedro Sanchez since his appointment as Prime Minister of Spain, when I visited Madrid on the 14th of June. Ireland and Spain have a long and excellent bilateral relationship, and our discussions were especially friendly and constructive. The Prime Minister and I exchanged views on important issues on the EU agenda at present, including Brexit, as well as foreign policy issues and bilateral relations. In addition to this, I briefed him on developments in Ireland, including in relation to the economy, and he briefed me on relations in Spain, including the priorities for his incoming government. He assured me of Spain's strong commitment to the European Union, and we agreed that the Union should focus on issues that can have a positive impact on the lives of citizens, including jobs and growth. We both agreed that maintaining an open and rules-based approach to trade is important for Europe's future prosperity. I briefed Prime Minister Sanchez, or President Sanchez rather, on Ireland's particular concerns on Brexit, in particular the vital importance of the backstop to ensure that there can be no return to a hard border in this island. I also stressed that there is now an urgent need to intensify efforts if we are to reach an agreement on the withdrawal agreement in good time, securing a period of stability that is of great importance to citizens and enterprises in the EU and, of course, the UK, and he offered me his full support and solidarity in that regard. On migration, President Sanchez briefed me on his government's decision to accept migrants on board the Aquarius, and we agreed on the need to find a long-term solution to this issue, which has become such a divisive one in the Union. We agreed that any solution had to include supporting economic and political development in Africa and the Middle East, creating better opportunities for people there, especially young people, as well as improving security and governance. We discussed the Commission's proposals for a new EU budget, and we agreed on our shared view that we needed to maintain spending on CAP at its current levels, as it is vital for our rural and agricultural communities. And we also agreed on the importance of cohesion spending. We both support a forward-looking budget to meet the challenges of the future, including considering new priorities if they bring added EU value. My visit to Madrid included an event with the Spanish-Irish Business Network, where I had the opportunity to engage with staff from our state agencies working on the ground in Spain, representatives from telecommunications, banking, tourism and the agri-food sectors, and I was impressed by the growing and vibrant links between our enterprise sectors. I haven't yet had an opportunity to speak to Prime Minister Conte of Italy, but I have written to congratulate him on his appointment and wish him well in his new role. I look forward to meeting him at the European Council in Brussels later this week. I've had 3 scheduled bilateral meetings with Prime Minister Rutte of the Netherlands in September last, in December in Dublin, and most recently in Brussels in March. And I've previously reported to the House in detail on these meetings. I also meet Prime Minister Rutte at formal and informal meetings of the European Council, including those in June, October, November and December of last year, and February, March and May of this year. We'll meet again later this week. We also both attended meetings of the Nordic-Baltic Group prior to the European Council, and an informal dinner hosted by Prime Minister Michel in Brussels in February. Ireland and the Netherlands are very much like-minded countries on many issues, including EU issues, and my exchanges with Prime Minister Rutte are always very open and constructive. He's been very strongly supportive of Ireland's position, and we together wish to see a comprehensive and ambitious future relationship with the UK, particularly when it comes to trade.
For your account of those meetings, and I table 2 questions, one in terms of the Prime Minister of Spain and Italy. Taoiseach, on December the 12th last year, the government stated that Phase 2 Brexit talks would be suspended if there was any backsliding on by the United Kingdom in relation to the backstop text. That's what you said, that there would, the talks would actually be suspended. And since then you have said on a number of occasions that they indeed have been backsliding, and in recent days you stated that no progress has been made in turning the backstop into a legal text. Can you confirm to the House, Taoiseach, your statement of the weekend that you believe that there has been no progress on the backstop text? Given how you and the Taoiseach have spent months demanding progress by June, can you outline for the House how you reconcile this with the fact that there is no consequence whatsoever for the backsliding? And we did have the Taoiseach saying that if there wasn't agreement or some progress in June, it was questionable whether there would be agreement at all on the issue. While we see no alternative to the approach which the Council will take on Friday, it has badly exposed the tough talking of our government as overhyped and more focused on headlines rather than substance. Can you outline what initiatives you have planned for the next 2 months, Taoiseach, to ensure that progress is made before the run-up to the October summit? Separately, Taoiseach, it is reported that your government has signed a letter with 11 other governments, which has been criticised today by the French government because it opposes proposals for a Eurozone budget. Had such a budget existed in 2010, there is no doubt that both the Portuguese and Irish bailouts would not have happened, and it is an essential element of preventing a reoccurrence of the sovereign debt crisis. So the question, Taoiseach, is why did you agree for Ireland to sign up to such a letter? Ireland should be one of the strongest supporters of the Franco-German initiative on this matter, yet at the first opportunity we have rowed in behind a counter-offensive. Why?
Taoiseach, I want to raise the issue in regard to your visit to Spain, and particularly the issue of the ongoing political crisis in Catalonia. And I wanted to ask you if you raised this issue with the new Spanish Prime Minister. The silence from many European states has been deafening when it comes to the condemnation of political repression in Catalonia, which has been orchestrated mainly by the Spanish government, has to be said. There are now 9 political prisoners jailed and awaiting trial in the so-called rebellion for organising last year's independence referendum. In fact, we know that in Germany, for instance, the extradition warrant against the former President Charles Puigdemont was declined because the court decided that there was no evidence of any form of violence by the organiser of the referendum, while in Belgium we had the bizarre spectacle of the prosecutors urging the court to throw out the warrant against 2 former Catalan ministers. the position that political prisoners, that political repression in Catalonia is an internal matter for Spain is no longer a practical way of moving forward. Your government, Taoiseach, needs to take a position of condemning the Spanish government for jailing political prisoners and political activists, and sincerely hope that you raise such concerns in your recent visit. Also, as you are aware, Taoiseach, ETA has recently announced a definitive end to the organisation, and it has created a historic opportunity for the Spanish government to send a positive signal of its intent to embrace the peace process in that region, which is long overdue. The Basque prisoners dispersed throughout Spain need to be brought back home as an initial step in that process. On the 10th of June, over 175,000 people from across the Basque region formed a 200-kilometre human chain across the country, demanding the right for these prisoners to be brought home and for the people of the Basque region to democratically decide their own future. I'm sure you're aware of these events, Taoiseach, and I would like to know that you raise these issues with the Spanish Prime Minister in your recent visit.
Taoiseach, we're very much, I suppose, insulated from the fire that's taking hold in southern Europe with the migration crisis, and Spain is at the centre of it now, along with Italy and Greece. You mentioned there that the upcoming council is likely to this is centre stage, and in your conversations with the Spanish Prime Minister, he will be looking, among other things, at various new governance and security arrangements. Can you give any indication, did he give any indication as to what that might mean for us, what we might be required to support? And indeed, in an earlier question today, you cited the fact that we previously agreed 4,000 programme refugees from Syria in the last iteration of the crisis. Is there a sense, or do you believe that coming out of these upcoming meetings that we'll be looking to further our intake of refugees as part of the overall management of this crisis, not leave everything on the shoulders of Spain, Greece and Italy? And then secondly, with regard to the Dutch Prime Minister, and it's true that we're very close, and as I understand, there's a kind of an informal relationship developing, not just with the Dutch government, but with other Scandinavian governments, with the Baltic states and ourselves, as a kind of an antidote to the potential future departure of Britain from the European Union. Can you tell me, has the Dutch Prime Minister indicated, or are you working collectively on any sort of informal meetings with such a grouping where you would actually meet together either in advance or separate to European Council meetings, so it would take on some sort of shape other than just a media notion? Is there any sort of informal approaches to kind of how we would work with such states within the Union in a collaborative way?
Deputy Howland.
Thank you, two issues will obviously dominate the upcoming European Council. We have a chance to deal with them tomorrow in statements. The issue of migration and the issue of Brexit. We had assumed up to relatively recently that the Brexit issue would be the definitive one. It may well be eclipsed now by migration. Can I ask you, just in terms of the very strong words expressed in this House last week by the President of the European Commission, do you remain confident that the support for Ireland is solid? I'm hearing reports from Brussels that the so-called Visegrad group of countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary, certainly are suggesting that a deal on trade is a very important one and might be more important to their interests than any issue in Ireland. It'd be interesting to hear your view on that. In relation to the definitive decision we were supposed to have on the Irish border issue for this Council, I expressed my concerns for some months now that this may well be fudged again and that we would be in a very difficult position in the run-up to the October Council. But we are, I suppose, where we are, and we can only hope that there's a very clear supporting line of all Member States behind you, Taoiseach, to ensure that we too are very crystal clear that there can be no ongoing trading relations or no long-term deal until these matters are resolved. And finally, if I can ask you in relation to migration, I presume you expressed congratulations to Prime Minister Sanchez on accepting a migrant boat into Spanish ports when that boat was rejected by Italy and Malta. And in concrete terms, what did you suggest Ireland could do to address, obviously, the European problem with migration?
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Just on the issue of Brexit and the border, the backstop and all that. I mean, last week I asked President Juncker whether we could trust him and the European Union on this issue. So, he looked slightly annoyed, but shouted yes across the room. We could trust him. But I want to ask you, Taoiseach, are you fully confident that the European Union is not, if negotiations fail with the UK, is not going to protect the single market, insist that some sort of border is put in place if they can't come to an agreement with Britain? And I ask that in particular because I don't trust Theresa May 1 inch, right? Not 1 inch. And I find her Little England or xenophobic nationalism obnoxious in the extreme. But it is worth saying that the EU withdrawal bill that was passed today in the Houses of Parliament, and this hasn't been mentioned in any, to my mind, in any of the media discourse, actually has legal provisions saying there'll be no border. Section 17 of the bill says that after negotiations, regardless of the outcome of those negotiations, there will be no customs posts, there will be no border checks, there will be no random stopping of cars or vehicles or whatever. There will be no border. It's absolutely spelt out in the EU withdrawal bill. So that's law now in Britain. Right? Now, of course, they can change the law, and I don't trust them, but at least it's in the law, and it has been passed by the British Houses of Parliament. Whereas, where's the guarantee from the European Union?
But that's not a guarantee.
Well, at least it's legal. Right? It's now got legal force. That they would have to change the law in order to impose a border, and that's obviously because of the pressure from this country, within Britain itself, from all sorts of forces, but it's actually now translated into a law. Right, which is binding on the British government.
Running out of time, Deputy.
Where is the binding obligation on the European Union to hold the line on the assurances they've given that there won't be a border? And just very lastly, I just want to ask the Taoiseach, did in his discussions with the Spanish Prime Minister, did he at all discuss the issue of Palestine, the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which takes on even more importance now that UNRWA are saying they don't have money to sustain their aid and education programmes in Gaza and the West Bank?
Taoiseach, please. We can take maybe 4 minutes on this response, if that's okay.
Thank you. I think, first of all, it's important to say, and I said it before, that the Brexit negotiations are dynamic and things change week on week. So we have to make judgment calls week on week as to what the right approach is to take. And certainly it's my judgment and the Taoiseach's judgment at present that stalling the talks would not be the right approach. What happens invariably when you walk out of talks is sooner or later you have to walk back in again. And it's our view that what's required now is that we intensify the talks, and that's what we expect to happen so that we can come to an agreement in October. Because as deputies will know, the withdrawal agreement has to be ratified both by the UK Parliament and the European Parliament, and we need those few months between the end of October and the end of March to make sure that agreement is ratified. But I'm also confident that the European Parliament won't ratify an agreement that either undermines the integrity of the single market or for some reason would leave Ireland adrift. When it comes to the recess, I intend to use the recess period to do a bit of shuttle diplomacy. I've managed to meet bilaterally with a lot of Prime Ministers either here in Dublin or in their capitals, and I intend to use the recess to meet some more, to visit some more EU capitals and receive some more people here. Obviously as well we'll be involved in intensifying negotiations through the task force, and we will have to continue and step up our contingency planning to prepare for the possibility, however remote, that there may be a no-deal Brexit, and we will need to proceed with that contingency planning. In relation to the Eurozone budget, which Deputy Martin raised, I'm not entirely sure which letter he's referring to. But obviously, if there was I don't recall signing such a letter. So, but I'll certainly check it out. Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, well, look, I'm not entirely sure which letter that is. There are a group of us who signed letters on the digital single market. There's a group of us who signed a set of letters a number of months ago. On different proposals, but so I'm not entirely sure which one. I'm sorry, I'm constantly being interrupted, Ken Carla, when I try to answer questions.
Yeah, well, no, Deputy Martin, you're out of order. Please.
Ken Carla, I haven't read the Financial Times today. I very rarely read the Financial Times, and there are many letters that we sign as groups of countries, and I'm not entirely sure which one this is, but if I'm not interrupted, I might be able to explain why.
Would you let the Deputy Martin, will you let the Taoiseach answer?
Because first of all, when it comes to the proposal for a Eurozone budget, which I think the Deputy is referring to the Maasberg Declaration from last week, when France and Germany jointly prepared a letter where they proposed a Eurozone budget. They do not suggest for a second that such a budget will be used for bailouts. It's the section on the ESM that they talk about bailouts for. They propose that the Eurozone budget be used for other things, and of course the Eurozone budget is one that we'd have to pay into. So, you know, it's not as the Deputy sees it. It's not suggested that a Eurozone budget be used to bail out Eurozone countries. It's proposed that the ESM would do that. To answer the questions that have been asked earlier, yes, I'm fully confident that the EU27 have our back. They all know that I won't agree, nor will the government agree to anything that gives rise to a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. In terms of the V4, I haven't heard anything from the V4 to give me concern. I know Deputy Martin says that they would be keen to have a trade deal with the UK. So would we. But I think everyone realises that it's going to take Deputy Howland, my apologies. Thanks for letting me answer, Brendan, anyway. At least I get a chance to answer your questions. But when it comes to the V4, I have no particular concerns from the V4, but thanks for alerting me to that. I'll make sure to check that out on Thursday and Friday. If they want to have a trade deal with the UK, well, so do we. But if the UK persists in its red lines, leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, well, then we're going to have to negotiate a whole free trade agreement de novo from scratch, and that is going to take years. No free trade deal was written in a few months. They all take years. So if the UK persists in its views of leaving the single market and the customs union, that free trade deal will take many years. So we'll have to have a withdrawal agreement first, and I don't see how we could have a trade agreement without having a withdrawal agreement, including the backstop first, and that's very much my position. We didn't raise the Basque Country wasn't discussed. Palestine wasn't discussed either. Venezuela was, but you never mentioned that, so I won't go through it in too much detail. In relation to Catalonia, that was discussed, and I raised it, in fact, and I certainly get the impression from Pedro Sanchez, from President Sanchez, that now that there is a new president in Madrid and there is a new president in Barcelona, that there is an opportunity for rapprochement. And I got the sense from him very much that he would be looking to come to a solution within the constitutional boundaries and constitutional rules of Spain, and a more conciliatory approach will be taken, I think, to Catalonia, and I think that's...
We're running out of time for the next groups of questions, so I think you're taking 6 and 7 together, Taoiseach.
As previously indicated, the National Risk Assessment is an annual exercise which aims to ensure a broad-based and inclusive debate on the strategic risks facing the country. It focuses on the identification of risks and is not intended to replicate or displace the detailed risk management and mitigation that happens across departments and agencies in relation to individual risks. As in previous years, my department, working with a cross-departmental steering group, prepared the initial draft of this year's report. The draft also reflects feedback from the open policy debate in April, where representatives from business, media, research and education institutions, civil society groups and the public sector were invited to discuss a draft list of risks. Following approval by Government on May 22nd, the draft was laid before the Oireachtas and published for public consultation. and the draft report is published and available to read on my department's website. The public consultation period closed last week. The draft report includes some new risks this year, including the impact of social media on public debate and the risk of the economy overheating. Existing risks have also involved. For example, the risks arising from Brexit have developed significantly and remain very prominent. Other risks include international uncertainties around tax and trade, increasing expectations for higher public expenditure, infrastructure constraints, housing supply and affordability problems, which persist. As in previous years, risks around climate change and the need for a secure and diverse energy supply present significant challenges for Ireland. They do so in terms of achieving national and international targets, mitigating our emissions and adapting to the effects of a changing climate. The cost of delayed action is discussed as a major factor in this risk. While biodiversity is not listed as a separate risk in its own right, the potential impact of climate change on our ecosystems is recognised in the climate change section of the draft report. In particular, the section highlights the potential of climate change to cause changes in the distribution and time of life cycle events of plant and animal species on land and in the oceans. Actions to tackle climate change will help maintain the integrity of ecosystems and therefore ensure that natural biodiversity present in these ecosystems is protected. The draft report also highlights the need to invest in new economic opportunities in the bioeconomy, which recognises environmental sustainability, including biodiversity as a core principle. Finally, the report also notes the need to decouple economic growth from adding to environmental pressures such as climate change and declining biodiversity. Following the conclusion of the public consultation stage last week, the list of strategic risks and the 2018 report will be finalised and published in July. The purpose of the consultation is to encourage debate on strategic risks, and the views of Oireachtas members are very welcome in the input to that discussion.
Now, Deputy Eamon Ryan, please.
I asked that we would include it in our debate on this issue last year, and I asked that again, and we made that submission to the consultation process. In my lifetime, we have lost half of the mass of wildlife invertebrates on this planet. Half of wildlife has disappeared. And we are at real risk of losing 37 bird species in this country. We're at real risk of losing a third of our bumblebee species. We're at real risk of losing the salmon and the eel and the pearl water fresh mussel. And I could go on. And we don't tend to notice it because it's small or it's hidden or it takes place over time. But at some day we'll wake up and realise that all the other risks were a minute fraction of the risk of us being inhabiting in a world where the natural world is destroyed and frayed and torn apart. And yes, it's connected to climate, so there's a real connection, the loss of habitat in one affecting the other and are being affected by climate change. And yes, loss of biodiversity will give us an indicator of how we're doing in climate, but in its own right, not just for economic reasons, but for reasons of our very sanity, our very sense of world, of what the world we're living in, we need to take loss of biodiversity seriously. We need a national land use plan. We need to stop burning the hills and cutting the hedgerows, which is what you're planning to do with legislation at the moment, which will destroy habitat unnecessarily. And we need to, it was interesting, we had the debate earlier on about cutting hay and, could we bend the rules because the weather's good at the moment and sure we can, But we saw in that RT Primetime programme the week before or last week, what happens when you come with bending the rules on the value of nature. So I say put it into the risk assessment. It is the big risk, one of the big risks we face, and that might change what everything government does to take this issue of biodiversity loss seriously.
Deputy Boyd Barrett, we need to...
Terms like biodiversity, I think, lose people because they're technical, but what we're talking about is the birds and the bees and the trees and the fish and so on that sustain our ecosystem on which we depend to survive. And that's what's actually under threat. This has it's a real economic threat in the sense that the depletion of biodiversity means, among other things, we face huge fines potentially because A diverse environment actually acts as a carbon sink. Monocultural forestry, for example, is not good to act as a carbon sink compared to native broadleaf species, where there's significant evidence of deforestation, according to the EPA. This is the highest. Deforestation is a feature of the last 5 or 6 years, despite targets to increase afforestation. In reality, the broadleaf tree species, there is significant evidence, according to the EPA, of deforestation. But to just give you 2 examples of where the rhetoric of a commitment to biodiversity is not matched by action, the kelp issue, right? Bioatlantis are going to start cutting down the trees of the sea in Bantry Bay. 1,900 hectares, which will destroy biodiversity in Bantry Bay. The Heritage Bill is going to extend the cutting season to cut down hedgerows, which will deplete biodiversity, and you are allowing that to happen. So all the commitments to biodiversity and to dealing with climate change are not followed through. In actuality, we are doing things to degrade and significantly degrade biodiversity.
Yes, first of all, I agree with the Green Party. I think it's correct when it states that the issue of biodiversity should be explicitly addressed in the national risk assessment following the consultation period. And the biggest reason for this, Taoiseach, is that existing commitments under the National Biodiversity Plan have not been implemented, and the greatest failings linked directly to lack of government coordination and inaction. The last biodiversity plan was 5 years ago, I think published by the last government. Only 1/4 of the specific recommendations and commitments in the plan were implemented. And for the 10% of commitments which saw no real progress, the main issue was a failure to have coordination in government or to communicate with the public. The communications failure is interesting because the objective was public education, but the reality was government brand building and promotion, very similar to the approach which the Taoiseach has been imposing across government. Given the failures in the last plan, Taoiseach, can you say if you have taken any steps to ensure that this new plan is implemented with urgency? And I would agree with the comments that have been made. We are reliant on NGOs in the whole area of beekeeping, for example, or the whole area of preservation of our bees. It's the NGOs who are developing action programmes and plans. And in terms of what Deputy Boyd Barrett said on broadleaf trees and so on, similarly, lack of government coordination and action on that front. And the Heritage Bill, I often wondered what inspired that Heritage Bill. Who was behind it? Coming from the department that it came from, it was quite absurd.
Thank you, Deputy.
From any perspective, in terms of the hedge cutting and so on like that. What inspired the Minister? Who lobbied? Who was behind it? And for what reason? Because it jars with our overall objectives and agenda in terms of preserving our biodiversity and national biodiversity, because it's at risk. We've been warned for years and for decades, and it should be explicitly part of a national risk assessment.
Please.
Thank you, Concordia. Taoiseach, the issue of biodiversity is something that certainly I'm very conscious of, coming from a very rural constituency, and one of the issues mentioned by Deputy Boyd Barrett in regard to monoculture and monoculture forestry is a very clear problem that we have, where it's not afforestation for the climate sequestration or carbon sequestration or anything else. It's basically a forestry policy which is about the timber industry making maximum profit, and that's supported by government policy and public policy. And really we need to see what way public policy can be used in a way to enhance biodiversity. And one of the examples of that is through the BLOS programme, which we mentioned earlier. And with due respect, I disagree slightly with the Green Party behind me in regard to bending the rules a little bit. Really, you know, everything that happens in nature happens when weather changes. And by and large, we have to work with the weather that we're given. And that's what farmers have to do. And that's what farmers always traditionally done. However, the intensification of agriculture has brought us in a different direction. And that has caused problems. And we need to recognise that and work with that. And in fairness to most people in the farming community, they want to work with that and they want to come up with solutions. But they need assistance in respect of that. The issue we have facing us at the moment with the very warm weather is going to be an issue around the whole fodder, and where farmers are going to be able to get enough fodder, and next winter we're going to be saying we had a hot summer and that's the reason we don't have the fodder issue, that we're going to be facing a crisis then, and then it will be a wet winter, and then it will be something else. But the reality is, a lot of these things, and I acknowledge, is not something that government can do anything about, but government policy and public policy has a role to play in respect of all that, and certainly the issue in regard to Bantry Bay and the seaweed harvesting that we see going on there is the equivalent of pouring Roundup into the ocean. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. And government policy, again, is at the root of that problem.
Deputy Howland.
I think this is a really important question. And I think one of our problems is that we debate issues like biodiversity in isolation as if it was a subject that doesn't run across everything else we do. And we don't have joined-up thinking on it. I suppose a wake-up call should have been the National Biodiversity Action Plan published last year. 90%, it said, of our habitats were in a bad or inadequate position, our peatlands. We're losing species, our bees are under threat, and yet we plough on with other action plans in other areas without actually having joined up thinking about them. And I think we need to do that, because Deputy Kenny is right. The notion that we will have a fodder shortage again, the notion that we import fodder because we have a developmental strategy for agriculture that's not sustainable. We have to decide what the island can sustain in terms of, for example, herd numbers and so on, and what we want in terms of biodiversity, and not set growth as the overarching objective that trumps all else. I do think we need to think long and hard about what the island of Ireland will look like, what species we are determined to protect, and what sort of joined-up thinking that runs across economic policy, agricultural policy, transport policy and so on, that is required to achieve those objectives.
Thank you. First of all, I'm glad to see the Minister for Communications and I suppose climate change here beside the Taoiseach today, because I had a topical issue last week in which I raised the fact that Ireland came second last behind Poland in terms of the Cannes report in respect of how Ireland was meeting its climate change obligations. As I say, we're second last out of 28 countries. That's not a good place to be. And of course, climate change enormously affects the kind of species and the types and growth of trees and so on. And we are nowhere near ready. We're actually in the last chance saloon as regards our response. And it is extremely disappointing that this government really seems to have long-fingered it in a way that frankly is depressing. But because climate change is what is leading to the enormous variations in the weather, and which is leading to the increase in the numbers of storms, notwithstanding the fact that the government have sought to respond to the storms and the orange and red warnings, nonetheless we are falling considerably behind. The other risk factor in relation to being so poor on climate change is that in a couple of years we face potentially enormous fines for not addressing the issue, and that financial risk to the country has not really been factored or costed in the way that other financial risks are.
Now, deputies, we've just over 10 minutes remaining, so will we give that over to this particular topic? Because we'll otherwise have severely reduced time for this third grouping. We'll see, Taoiseach, anyway. You want to go ahead? Yeah, go ahead, Taoiseach, anyway, with your response.
Okay. I suppose, first of all, I may have to disappoint the deputies a little bit. The latest weather forecast indicates that it's going to rain on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. So it may well be the case that the anticipated drought and dry weather-related fodder crisis may not materialise on this occasion. In terms of the damage to biodiversity, it's not a standalone risk, or not a standalone strategic risk in its own right in the current draft. It's covered under the whole issue of climate change, but I certainly am open to including it. But you do need to draw the line somewhere. So what I'll have to do with my officials is to examine the submissions. I suspect when we examine them we'll see 20, 30, 40, 50 other risks that people think should be included, you do need to draw the line somewhere. But I'm certainly not hostile to including additional risks if the submissions indicate that there is a consensus in favour of adding additional risks, like, for example, the risk to biodiversity. So I'll take account of what was said here today and consider that for the final iteration before it goes to Cabinet. In terms of biodiversity more generally, the action plan recognises that there is an increased need for funding. That was set out at the NDP launch by Ministers Madigan, O'Donoghue and McHugh, as well as the state agencies who have been asked to contribute to the drafting of the plan. The plan's main aims are built around the need for all sectors of society to participate if we, our society, are to conserve nature. So they are to maintain mainstream biodiversity across decision-making in the state, strengthen the knowledge base underpinning work on biodiversity issues, increase public awareness and participation, ensure conservation of biodiversity in the wider countryside, ensure conservation in the marine environment, and expand and improve on the management of protected areas such as national parks and SACs and protected species. Some of the actions that government is taking include legislation, for example the National Parks Bill, and the introduction of a requirement that public bodies consider biodiversity policy in decision-making. Actions involving forestry and agriculture, which account for 70% of total land use in the state. Measures to reduce the impact of invasive alien species. And also a commitment to integrating biodiversity in our overseas aid programme. We recognise that biodiversity and healthy ecosystems have a role to play in underpinning many sustainable development goals, or many of the sustainable development goals, and stronger partnerships are required in the area of sustainable development and climate finance to ensure we protect our biodiversity. We're also investing in farmer-led, results-based payment schemes in the Burren, which has been a huge success over many years, and new schemes to protect the endangered hen harrier and the freshwater pearl mussel. The farmers are also paid both for work undertaken and for the delivery of defined environmental objectives, including sustainable management and restoration of high nature farmland and improvements in water quality and water use efficiency. Continued investment in farmer-led results-based payment schemes will certainly benefit biodiversity and provide an excellent model for future agri-environmental supports in Ireland.